Okay, I think we're live. Good morning, afternoon, or night, depending where you're listening from. Um, I would like to welcome everybody to this conversation about AUKUS, Brazil, and the nuclear non-proliferation regime. I am Vitória Guimarães, student from the Programa de Pós-Graduação em Relações Internacionais Santiago Dantas Unesp Unicamp PUC São Paulo, member of GEDES, Grupo de Estudos de Defesa e Segurança Nacional, and currently a visiting researcher at the School of Political Science and International Studies POSIS in the University of Queensland. I'm being advised there by Professor Dr. Sebastian Kempf and Dr. Marian Hansen, and would like to thank them for their guidance and motivation for this event. This event was possible due to the existing partnership between São Paulo State University and the University of Queensland through the Development, International Politics and Peace Network, which is part of the CAPI Spring program. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for accepting our invitation to speak today. I'd also like to thank my advisor, Professor Dr. Samuel Alves Soares, for his support of this event. Unfortunately, he was taken ill today and will not be joining us. I'd also like to thank Marianne Janot for technical support and Emily Sievers for promoting the event at UQ. I would like to express what a great honor and privilege it is to be moderating this discussion. I am surrounded today by such great scholars with all with very different angles and perspective with respect to this topic being discussed today. I am really interested in these conversations and already have some questions myself, and believe I'll probably have even more by the end of the presentations. All those who have any question, please feel free to make them at the chat, and we will read them all the questions at the end of the presentations. This event also has certificates, so we will be making we will make the registration link available at the end of the presentations. Um, Also, due to personal situation, Dr. Marian Hansen will be leaving earlier, so right after her presentation, we'll be taking in some questions from the public. So please feel free to get your questions in the chat. Just going to give a little bit of context about the AUKUS partnership and Brazil and the non-proliferation regime. In September 2021, the world was surprised with the announcement of the AUKUS security partnership between the U.S., the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia, especially with respect to the acquisition of conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines. Let me emphasize, not nuclear armed, and the unprecedented sharing of sensitive classified information. This announcement was very significant since only 6 countries, the US, Russia, UK, France, China, and India, currently possess nuclear-powered submarines. All of them possess nuclear weapons, and with the exception of India, are members of the UN Security Council and formally recognized as nuclear weapon states by the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. Recently, in 2023, more details about the AUKUS partnership were shared with the public. The AUKUS announcement in 2021 unsurprisingly dominated the media. Many mentioned how Australia could become the first non-nuclear weapon states to have nuclear-powered submarines. It is interesting, though, that many in the media failed to even mention Brazil, even though the country, a non-nuclear weapon state, has been developing a conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarine since the late 70s, as well as the fact that the AUKUS announcement placed pressure on Brazil, which soon after started conversations with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. It should be emphasized that although it is not illegal to acquire or develop nuclear-powered submarine, as Dr. Martin Hansen has pointed out in previous speeches, it undermines the spirit of the NPT. Nuclear-powered submarines have serious implications to the NPT, especially with respect to its non-proliferation pillar. These implications have already been recognized by several academics, including those who support the AUKUS partnership. The serious implications to the non-proliferation pillar has to do with the fact that in the NPT and the IAEA safeguard system, there exists what many academics have called a loophole, whose existence will be contested by one of our speakers. This loophole allows non-nuclear states to remove fissile material from safeguard regime and use it in non-weapon and non-explosive related military applications like fueling nuclear submarine reactors. Currently, there are no safeguards for naval reactors. Hence, it is difficult to guarantee that the material being used to propel nuclear submarines will not be diverted to military ends such as nuclear weapons. This event intends to reflect on the consequences of Brazil's and Australia's decision to nuclear regime and its neighbors. We are very privileged today to be able to hear Brazil, Australia, and Indonesia, a strategic partner of Australia, perspective toward this topic. Representing Australia perspective, we have Dr. Marianne Hansen, who is a professor in the University of Queensland, Brisbane, Australia. She was stipendiary lecturer in politics at Magdalene College, Oxford University, before she joined UQ in 1995. She has been a visiting scholar at Liu Center for Study of Global Issues, Department of International Relations at the University of British Columbia, a visiting fellow at the Department of International Politics, University of Wales, Aberystwyth, and a visiting scholar at Sciences Po in Paris. Marian holds a Bachelor of Fine Art class honors of the from the University of Queensland, Master of Philosophy, and Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford. Representing Indonesia perspective, we have Dr. Muhadi Sujoni, a lecturer at the Department of International Relations and a researcher at the Institute of International Studies, Universitas Gadjah Mada, Indonesia. I'm sorry about my pronunciation. Holds a master's in political science and the Australian National University and a bachelor from Universitas Gadjah Mada. He is a former head of Center for Security and Peace Studies and a former head of the Center for Southeast Asia Social Studies at the University of Gadjah Mada. Representing Brazil perspective, we have Dr. Marcos Vale Machado da Silva, who's a professor at the Brazilian Naval War College. He holds a bachelor's degree in naval science from Brazilian Naval Academy, a master's degree in international relations from Rio de Janeiro State University, a master's degree in strategic studies, and a doctorate degree in political science from Fluminense Federal University, Rio de Janeiro. Marcos has been engaged in a research project entitled The Conventional Nuclear-Powered Submarine Program and the IAEA Safeguards. As you can see, we have a very well-prepared scholars to elucidate the meaning of the decision made by Brazil and Australia to the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Thus, without further delay, I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Marianne Hansen.
Thank you, and hello and welcome to everybody. I'm currently in Hiroshima in Japan, and it seems to be a fitting place to be. This is my first visit here. And as we're talking about the potential for nuclear proliferation and, of course, the wider impact of nuclearism in general, I'm very happy to be talking here today. So, Victoria, are you happy for me to go ahead and make my presentation now?
Yes.
Right. Thank you. All right. I'll start off what I'm going to be doing today. And if the slideshow could be started, thank you. I'm going to talk about three aspects of AUKUS in Australia. First, I want to try to draw out some of the motivations, the things that have prompted AUKUS to happen and why Australia has been so keen to be a part of this. Next, I'll look very briefly at Australia's record in terms of being quite active on non-proliferation and to a lesser extent on disarmament issues. And then I will explore some of the problems with AUKUS. So let's move on to the first slide. All right. The key motivation, I think, is the fear amongst various security officials that China is a threat. Now, we know that China is a growing power. It is a state which is increasing its military, including its nuclear capabilities. I would also say that China is Australia's biggest trading partner, and that for the most part, we've enjoyed a reasonably stable relationship with China. I have to say, however, that over the past 2 or 3 years in Australia, there has been what I feel is an overstated and exaggerated threat that has been publicized very strongly. And you can see in the slide there some excerpts from a recent study, which was really very exaggerated. And it claimed that Australia would be the target of Chinese war, which really I think is very far-fetched. That study has been discredited as being very problematic. Nonetheless, it is ideas like that which seem to be driving this push for greater militarization and for joining the United States in being much more prominent in the Asia-Pacific region. So the second motivation is that Australia has a long history of complying with US requests. We've been a very close ally of Washington. We have been involved in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. We've lost a lot of troops in each of those wars. So we really have no history, in my view, of an independent security and foreign policy. It's very much tied in with our what we feel are our obligations to do what the US asks us to do. Now, third motivation, I think, is that there is a keen sense by some to develop a nuclear industry within Australia. Australia has no nuclear power capabilities, and in general, we have steered away from that. We've been keen instead to rely on other sources of energy, but there has been some lobbying for Australia to open up and become more reliant on nuclear energy. And I think that this has played a part, this lobby group has played some part in getting AUKUS up and running. All right, let's look then briefly at Australia's record on non-proliferation and disarmament. Australia, I think, likes to see itself as a good international citizen, and it does have a generally good record of supporting the United Nations, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, etc. However, Australia, I think, is very conflicted, because my sense is that despite 200 plus years of sort of existing as a country, an independent state, well, since 1900 we've been an independent state, but I think that Australia has never really reconciled itself with being in the Asia Pacific. Now, of course, Australia has been inhabited for over 60,000 years by the Aboriginal people of Australia. But what I'm talking about here is the sense of being somewhat alienated in the Asia Pacific and being something of an outpost of the West by the settler society here in Australia. So this has led to a very fearful approach to security during white Australia's history, at least. The people have looked to the United Kingdom as the protector, and since 1945, the US as protecting Australia's position in the Asia-Pacific region. And that brings with it some problems, of course. At times, various governments in Australia have actually championed disarmament. They're generally in favor of non-proliferation initiatives. On disarmament, they have been less active. But we've seen some instances, such as the Canberra Commission in 1995, not long after the Cold War ended. We've seen another initiative, the Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. But inevitably, what happens is that while these commissions and studies are very useful, inevitably the government tends to side with the US and agrees with the US at the NPT, in other forums. And this includes the reluctance to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So why do I think AUKUS is problematic? I've outlined a number of reasons here, and I'll try to explain these briefly. The first that I'd like to point out is the cost. It's estimated to cost Australia $368 billion. Probably that figure will increase. And this is at a time when Australians are undergoing a real cost of living crisis, when we are seeing strains in our health and education system, and of course, when our environmental disasters that we are suffering here in Australia, bushfires, massive floods as a result of climate change, these really do need more attention and more money. And so many people in Australia are saying that this is really a large amount of money and the opportunity costs are very high. Moreover, these submarines won't be delivered until the 2040s, and it will be probably likely to be around 2050 by the time we get the last of the submarines. In terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Australia argues that it's not doing anything illegal, it's not doing anything against the treaty. And while this might be true in terms of the technical realities, because there isn't an outright ban on states receiving nuclear naval propulsion, it's simply not something that's addressed very clearly in the treaty. So Australia argues that this is quite legal, but I would suggest that it goes against the spirit of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And as Victoria mentioned earlier, when this goes through, or if it goes through, Australia will become the first non-nuclear weapon state to be given this technology. And this does set a risky precedent. Already we've seen a number of other states saying, well, we would like the same kind of treatment within the NPT. And if Australia is able to receive this material, then we also should be able to do that. And the problem, of course, is that while Australia might not have the intention of developing nuclear weapons from the material that is given to it, there can be no absolute guarantees about that. And there can be no guarantees that any other state which might receive the same treatment won't develop nuclear weapons covertly. Another key problem is that the submarines, the designs that have been chosen are going to use highly enriched uranium. Indeed, this will be weapons-grade material. It's estimated that the amount of material on each submarine could, if converted to, and I'm not suggesting Australia will do this, but technically it could produce up to 20 nuclear bombs on each of the 8 submarines. So we're talking about a substantial amount of fissile material here. And the management of that, of course, is a key issue because the safeguards clearly don't apply to nuclear propulsion on submarines. The other point is that in any case, these submarines, which are attack submarines designed to go for long distances, right up to China's coast, are not really a good choice for maritime defense. Many people have argued that smaller submarines, conventionally powered submarines, are far better for providing defense of Australia's coastline. And indeed, that's what we have been using in the past. So the switch to nuclear-powered submarines represents a strategic pivot away from being a defensive issue into something that is seen as an attack or an offensive capability in tandem with the United States. And clearly, China sees it this way, which is why it has been quite critical of the proposal. There are also fears that because of the nature of the submarines, that Australia could lose some control, could lose some of its sovereignty in how these nuclear-powered submarines will operate, particularly once they are a distance away from Australia. And at the broader level, there is the sense that the US will be, to some extent at least, determining our strategic decisions. And that goes to the heart of sovereignty, where, as an independent sovereign state, Australia should be making these decisions for itself. It should be developing an independent policy, and it should retain control over its strategic decisions. But that seems to be loosening under AUKUS, and there appears to be a willingness to give the United States, the United Kingdom, a much greater say over Australia's strategic decisions. And finally, this has been seen as a reversion to the Anglosphere. In other words, something of a backward step, which marries Australia up with the United Kingdom, the United States, as its sort of traditional allies from the previous century. In this sense, I think that AUKUS runs the risk of reinforcing the inequalities in the NPT. And why do I say this? Well, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is in itself a very unequal treaty. It effectively accepts the nuclear status of 5 states. Although they are required to move to disarmament eventually, there is no timeline set for this. Now, non-nuclear states, especially those in the global south, feel that this division is, while it was meant to be a temporary situation, this has gone on for too long. And the fact that the US is willing to give this material and this technology to a Western state when it has refused to allow any other states to acquire this kind of technology and material, this seems to reinforce a view that the NPT is being managed and driven in a very selective way by the United States and the United Kingdom. And in relation to that, we can also see that there was no consultation with our near neighbors, our neighbors in ASEAN and in the South Pacific. And Dr. Mohadi will be speaking to this. But the broader argument here is that Australia appears to be neglecting its nearest neighbors and their security concerns in its push to have this special friendship with the United States and the United Kingdom. And the implication really is that 3 white Western states will be determining security policies and managing security in the Asia Pacific, which I think is somewhat problematic within our region. So I'm happy to end my presentation there and to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marian Hansen. I would like to know, there isn't yet any questions in the chat, but I would like to know if any of the speakers would like to make any questions. If not, I have some of my own. So Dr. Marcus Valles or Dr. Muhadi Sojourner, have any questions?
Not yet so far.
Okay. I have a question that is related. It's not directly related to the AUKUS, but has to do with the Australian National Defence Strategic Review that was released this week. Just a bit of context for those who are listening. On the 3rd of August 2022, a defense strategic review, the review was requested by March 2023. The government received the report on 14 February 2023. This public version of the review is very qualitative different from the February 23 version. It has less details because many of the recommendations on the review are sensitive and classified. So, but the review does talk about the challenges requiring a whole of government and a whole of nation effort. So I don't know if you can speak a little bit on this. And then also a few things that I thought was interesting about the review is that the review acknowledges that the Australian Defence Force, ADF, as currently constituted and equipped, is not fully fit for the purpose. And then I wanted to know, what is the meaning of having that written in a formal document? I mean, I believe it's one thing to acknowledge that informally, but to put it in a document, it's another thing. So what were they trying to achieve by doing this, by explicitly, putting that in the document? And then they focus the government immediate action to reprioritize defense capability in line with the review's recommendation include invest in nuclear powered submarines through AUKUS partnership. That's the first thing that they include. And so I'd like you to comment on that, if it has like some kind of connection that is not fully fit for purpose. And then first thing that is a priority is the nuclear powered submarine. And then a few other points is like, how can Australia engage in and vigorously pursue its own international interests, as is said in the review, when through AUKUS it is tied, like you said, to US and UK interests, that will be determining its security policies. So, and then also I would like to question about the fact that you talked about neglecting the near neighbors, and then the fact that in the review it talks about maintaining a regional balance of power in the Indo-Pacific and deepening diplomatic engagement, which this engagement was not done when it made the decision. It did not consult its near neighbors, and which has caused many problems as we see in the media. But then also public domestically, it did not talk to the public, also its population, and this has caused many concerns, which we've talked a lot already about. But I would like you to talk this a little bit so that Brazilian listeners can also hear, and also Australians. And I have more, but I think I'll leave those questions for now, and then I'll get into other points, I believe. Okay, thank you.
Sure. Let me start with the Defence Strategic Review, which I think is very, very interconnected with the AUKUS decision. And the results of the Strategic Review were not surprising to many of us, because it really is part of this push to reorient Australia's defence policy towards a much more expanded and activist security role in the Asia Pacific with the United States and the United Kingdom. And as I say, this is quite a shift for Australia, because I don't think it's been thought through well enough. It is siding with the United States, which of course is a declining hegemon in the region, but which is reluctant to see any competition, strategic or economic competition, and that's how it views China. We go along with this, although it's not actually in our interests. It's not in our economic interest to do so. It's not in our security interest to do so. And I guess one thing I should add, which perhaps I didn't mention in the presentation, there is a big divide in Australia. There is a view amongst ordinary Australians that we have been shifting more and more closely to the United States, and to basically doing what Washington asks us to do. And so the fear is that Australia is being used, if you like, as a military base for the United States in order to strike China, in order to have a much stronger role in the Pacific region than it already has. And we have an increasing number of US troops going through various bases in Australia. We have B-52 bombers. Admittedly, they're not carrying nuclear weapons. These are now being brought to Australia. So people see that there's a greater degree of militarization of society, and that this militarization is very much hand in hand with Washington's strategic aims of addressing a rising China. I think that, I've already stated that I believe that fear of China is really overdrawn and has been manufactured to some extent. but it represents such a change away from our traditional approaches. What the Strategic Defense Review showed was, well, it basically argued that we've got to balance the power in the region, meaning a rising China means we've got to support a greater US presence. But indeed, what Australia is doing is siding completely with the United States. Our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, made an important speech about 10 days ago, and in it, she claimed that what Australia's security policies and what AUKUS was doing was trying to maintain a balance in the Asia-Pacific region. But she's been criticized for this because clearly the AUKUS decision and the statements made in the Defence Review show that Australia is becoming more aggressive, dare I say it, more activist in the region in support not of both powers, but of one. In Washington, Washington's interests are what prevail. There has been some pushback from other elements of the military. This enormous amount of money will be going to Australia's Navy, but there are indeed long-standing claims that the Army and the Air Force need to be rejuvenated somewhat. And with this focus on acquiring nuclear-powered submarines at an enormous cost, there is a sense that other aspects of the military are not being given sufficient funding for their purposes.
Great. I have one more question that is regarding to the practical cooperation that the review talks about with key powers such as Japan and India. And then they also talk about an Australian submarine agency. And I would like to know how independent will this agency be? Is this Australian submarine agency being created with regards to safeguards, even though Australia apparently in some comments made it was not going to apply it? So just want to know what are they were trying to say, meaning when they were mentioning the Australian submarine agency that they plan to.
Sorry, what was the last part of your question?
The Australian submarine agency.
Yeah.
What is the review is meant when it made mention to this agency that they plan on, I guess, developing or creating?
I don't know enough about the Australian submarine agency to be able to answer that question fully, but I can say something about the Quad. This is the Quadrilateral Security Initiative, which is basically the United States, Australia, Japan, and India. That's been around for a while, but it has recently been re-energized, again, because of this perception of a rising China. Again, it signifies a coalition, a loose coalition, directed against China. And this is why, this is rather problematic. Now, I think that in the case of India and Japan, they are less likely to see this in the binary terms that Washington employs. But nonetheless, the development of the Quad, bringing India and Japan very firmly into these security decisions, is again something that is seen as provocative by China. So it really goes hand in hand with the shift in Australian foreign policy towards being more vocal, more activist against China. But I would stress again that this is not necessarily the view of many Australians who believe that our security and foreign policy has been captured by a very pro-US group of people.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer. I think I can have one last question. I'm sorry, I wasn't planning on making so many, but since there's like no questions in the chat, I think we can make one more question that it's regarding the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
Yes.
I want to know how is Australian instance with regard to this treaty, since I know we've mentioned before, but I'd like you to stress it here too. Since it is now, this partnership with the United Kingdom and the US. I guess it does put more pressure in Australia. But then the incumbent prime minister mentioned before he got elected that Australia would reviewing, its position towards this treaty. So how is it, going right now? It's still Australia still hasn't really positioned itself again, but I'd like to know what are your comments on that.
Yes. The current party in government promised in 2018 that if they gained power, which they did about a year ago, that they would sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This is something that is fairly controversial for Australia because clearly our major ally, the United States and Britain also, do not want us to sign the TPNW. What is interesting about this is that our Prime Minister is very much in favour of the elimination of nuclear weapons, as are the majority of Australians and a large number of parliamentarians. But of course, we face pressure from the United States not to proceed with signing that treaty. So what is going to be really interesting is the interplay between the people of Australia who are pushing for Canberra to sign that treaty and the ability of the national government to defer that position while not appearing to be going back on its word. It has recently recommitted that statement. It has said, yes, we do intend to sign the treaty. And I should add here that it's actually something that can be done while still retaining our alliance status with the United States. So the ANZUS Treaty makes no mention whatsoever of a nuclear umbrella. And it is quite possible for Australia to remain a partner of the United States, provided that we don't cooperate on nuclear issues. So as long as we renounce a nuclear umbrella, as long as we aren't involved in supporting nuclear weapon activities, then we can sign the TPNW and remain an ally of the United States. And in fact, some allies of the US have already signed, a number of Western states, and if you look at New Zealand, for example. So they argue that these things are compatible. Whether or not the government will do that in its first term, we don't know. We are hoping that it will.
Okay, thank you very much for all your answers. And
My
now
pleasure.
have Dr. Muhaji Swajoni representing, I guess, Indonesian perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Could you please? Okay. Thank you very much once again for inviting me. Nice to see you all, especially Marianne and also Professor. I guess, sorry, I forgot the name. Fellow. Okay, I would like to present the Indonesian perspective on Australia's nuclear power submarines. This is a quite interesting topic. When the agreement of a trilateral security pact between Australia, the United States, and UK took place, it has brought several responses from the Southeast Asian states. There was no single response from the region, but at least two countries, Malaysia as well as Indonesia, have been very critical. They expressed their strong reservation of the decision of Australia to acquire nuclear power submarines, despite the fact that Australia government tried to insist that the submarines will not carry nuclear weapons. So, how Indonesia responded to this decision? The Indonesian government responded to the announcements almost immediately with a statement on 17 September 2021, stating that it was deeply concerned of the continuing arms race and power projection in the region. The statement, at the same time, also stressed the importance of the Australian commitment to continue meeting all its nuclear obligations, non-nuclear obligations. So those two statements are very strong, which indicates that the decision to acquire nuclear power submarine is in contradiction with the Australian commitment to meet all of its non-nuclear obligations. And this early response was reiterated in a month later when the Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi said that in Indonesian view, the proposed submarine deal would certainly not benefit anyone. This is probably supporting what Marian has mentioned before about the interest of Australia in the geopolitical constellation in the region. And the Foreign Minister of Indonesia added that the effort to maintain a peaceful and stable region must continue, which means that the decision by Australian government to acquire nuclear power submarine is not consistent with the effort to maintain a peaceful and stable region. And this will be contradictory to these goals. So Indonesian government really would like to stress that Indonesian government didn't want to see an arms race was taking place in the region. So this is the initial response. Now, why Indonesia responded very critically to the decision of the Australian government to acquire nuclear power submarine? Next, please. So, with regards to Indonesian concern, in the Indonesian view, the concern is not without basis. Indonesia is a strong proponent of nuclear disarmament. Former Indonesian Foreign Minister, for example, Dr. Hasan Wirayuda, referred to nuclear disarmament as the DNA of Indonesian foreign policy. So, despite the government of Australia effort to convince the Indonesian government that Australia does not have any intention to develop a nuclear weapons, for Indonesia, Australia effort to acquire high enriched uranium powered nuclear submarine would set an unwelcome precedent. So Marian has already explained very detailed about this. In the Indonesian view, even if Australia government does not intend to develop nuclear weapon, its acquisition of nuclear submarines would push open a loophole in the IAEA safeguard provision, and this poses a risk to the NPT. Why? Because while they do not fit neatly into any of the three pillars of the NPT, nuclear submarines are situated in something of a gray area. For a non-nuclear state like Australia to acquire them requires a testing of what is meant by the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Nuclear power submarine would fall into a category of military use of nuclear material, even if this is for non-explosive means. And for Indonesia, allowing this to happen could open a Pandora box of nuclear proliferation and set a precedent that other countries will seek to follow. And as we listen also from the next presentation, I think there are other countries who are also interested in developing such kind of nuclear power submarines. This government view was further reflected in a statement in which Indonesia stressed the importance of Australia's commitment to continuing to fulfill all its obligations on nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Such a commitment is very important for Indonesia. This is more or less related to the dynamics of Indonesia and Australia relations. For example, the response to the Australian government intention to acquire nuclear power submarine did not come only from the government of Indonesia. As soon as Indonesian foreign minister commented on and raised concern about the decision, the hashtag Australia berbohong, Australia lied, became a trending topic on Twitter. This is quite interesting. Indonesian population does not very often commented on foreign policy, does not commented on the international affairs. But in the case of the Australian, the news of the Australian acquisition of nuclear power submarine, this issue has become a trending topic. Whether or not this is because of the nuclear issues or because of simply reflecting the dynamic in the relations between Indonesia and Australia is still very unclear. But the fact that the decision has been a trending topic in Indonesian with a very bad connotation that Australia is not trustable for Indonesia is very clear in the social media. So this, for me, is simply reflects the disappointment with the Australian decision. For one, is that because of the decision itself for Australia to acquire nuclear submarines, but the second one is the decision was made without consulting Indonesia. It's another story. As the closest neighbors, it is very strange for the public that that Australian government made such a very big decision without any information to the government of Indonesia. So, what Indonesia have done to express this concern? Indonesia brought the issue to the NPT Review Conference by presenting what's called Indonesian paper on nuclear naval submarines. So the paper basically consisted of two parts. The first part is about Indonesian interest. It is about the fact that Indonesia is an archipelagic country. Indonesia, in such a position, is concerned with potential hazard to the environment and human of the traffic and accident involving naval nuclear propulsion. So when such nuclear power submarine enter Indonesian territory, in which Indonesia is separated, Indonesian territory is separated by seas, in which the nuclear submarine can go through the Indonesian territory, then the potential hazard has been very big, not only in terms of the environment, but also in terms of the human impact when, for example, an accident happens with the submarine. So, having expressed its interest, Indonesia also made a proposal that all naval nuclear propulsion should be monitored internationally by IAEA regulations. Article 3 of the NPT, for example, requires non-nuclear weapon states to allow all nuclear facilities and materials to be inspected by the IAEA. The NNP belonging to the non-nuclear weapon states should be able to be monitored as well under the IAEA safeguard system. And in the Article 3 also, stipulated that nuclear facilities and material belonging to the nuclear weapon state are not subject to IAEA safeguard rules. Therefore, this is quite interesting as a loophole for the nuclear submarine. The nuclear powered submarine belonging to the nuclear weapon state is not subject to inspection, according to the NPC. And neither is the nuclear powered submarine belonging to non-nuclear state party regulated in the Article 3. So having said that, this is something that needs to be taken into account very seriously, and therefore, without any agreement on this issue, Indonesia is proposing that all naval nuclear propulsion should be monitored internationally by IAEA regulation. And if we look at this proposal in the context of Indonesian concern with the Australian commitment, we can understand this very clearly, that, okay, even if Australia said that it is not about nuclear weapons, but like any non-nuclear weapon state, then all the nuclear material should be inspected by the IAEA and subject to IAEA regulations. So this is basically how Indonesia responded to the decision by the Australian government to acquire nuclear power submarine. Now, let's take the Indonesian position and projected it at the regional level. Next, please, my last slide. Indonesian position is reflected very well regionally. Of course, with regard to the AUKUS decision to give Australia a system to develop a nuclear power submarine, there is no single, as I mentioned before, no single ASEAN response to the nuclear submarine deal. But if we look at broader context of Southeast Asian geopolitical dynamics, in the 1971, Southeast Asian countries declared Southeast Asia as a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. This was adopted in the context of the Cold War, where the two big powers, the Soviet Union at the time and the US, tried to intervene into the region and created division within the region. ASEAN itself was established as a consequence of this rivalry, superpower rivalry. So the declaration of Southeast Asia as a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality was aimed at preventing outside power to intervene into the region of politics. And with regard to nuclear weapons, in 1995, the Southeast Asian countries adopted what's so-called the Bangkok Treaty, that is the Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapon Free Zone. This should be seen as a continuation of the Southeast Asia zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, but more specifically on the issue of nuclear weapons. So if we look at the decision by the Australian government to acquire nuclear power submarine with this Southeast Asian nuclear weapon free zone, then it makes sense that Indonesia is very, very critical to the Australian decision. If it is still very unclear whether they should be categorized as nuclear weapons as such, but at least this nuclear facility developed for the nuclear nuclear submarine should be subjected to the IAEA inspection. And this is quite important. So supporting what Marianne has mentioned before, that this is about the feeling of injustices in the international nuclear regime, in which there is a kind of what's so-called apartheid, which gives privilege to some country to have the nuclear weapons, and others are not allowed to develop a nuclear weapon. But this decision by the Australian government to acquire nuclear power submarine create a gray area in which it is uh, a decision by non-nuclear weapon states, but it has uh, consequence with the nuclear energy in association with non-nuclear, non-peaceful uses, that is in the military instrument. So this is the way in which Indonesian government sees the decision by the Australian government to look at the decision by Australians to develop a nuclear power submarine. And now, in the bigger context for Indonesia, the decision by Australia will add the tension in the region, which is actually growing now with the competition between the US and China. And as Marian mentioned, that the decision has made Australia more aligned with the US, and does not, in Indonesian view, does not help in reducing the tension in the region. So this is basically the broader dimension of this the Indonesian decision. And if I can add one other context to give it more broader context, for example, Indonesia has influenced how ASEAN should respond to the competition and rivalry between the US and China by proposing what so-called ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, in which ASEAN would like to see, instead of a situation in which ASEAN should choose among two competing parties, ASEAN would like to see that Indo-Pacific should be open to all, and Southeast Asian countries should not be forced to choose among the different sides. And this is the decision by the Australian government seems to indicate that Australia is not having such a position to see the Indo-Pacific as open, but open to all, but it takes sides on the side of the US against China. So this is basically the overview of the Indonesian position with regard to the AUKUS and the decision by Australia to acquire nuclear power submarine. More can be discussed further in the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, okay, thank you so much, Professor. I would like now to invite Professor Marcus Vadi to make his speech so that we can have discussions later. Thank you.
Let me try to put my presentation here. Okay. So, good evening, good morning. My name is Marcos Valley, and I'm a professor at Brazilian Naval War College. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Many thanks, Victoria, for inviting me. And initially, I would like to greet Professors Marianne Hanson and Muhadi Sugiano and all our distinguished guests who watch us through this channel. I choose to approach the proposed subject according to the following talking points, starting with a brief introduction to my particular subject on this roundtable. There is the existence of a possible gap or loophole in the nuclear weapons non-proliferation regime related to nuclear material intended for the propulsion of naval assets of non-nuclear weapon states. This issue has never been raised as a source of controversy. Only the 5 nuclear weapon states recognized in the NPT, plus India, which is not a signatory to the NPT, are the owners of the nuclear power submarines, as Victoria mentioned earlier. However, with the steady advancement of the Brazilian conventionally armed nuclear powered submarine program, and more recently, since September 2021, the possibility of Australia receiving or even developing a nuclear-powered submarine within the AUKUS strategic partnership has added a new perspective to this issue. Additionally, other non-nuclear weapon states have stated their intention to develop programs of this nature. The case of Iraq, the Republic of Korea, and Iran, or have already expressed that intention in the past. The Canada and Argentina case. Furthermore, some countries have the technology for this. Japan is an example. And due to the change in the international security environment, they may choose to develop this type of weapon systems. So in this context, I would like to propose a question for us to debate. Is there a gap in the nuclear weapons non-proliferation regime related to the use of nuclear material for propulsion of submarines by non-nuclear weapon states? The debate or the question proposed here is part of the debate that arises from interpreting paragraph 14, non-application of safeguards to nuclear material to be used in non-peaceful activities of the framework of all comprehensive safeguards agreements, the CSAs, for non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT, that is the INCIRC 153. In other words, a non-nuclear weapon states can invoke paragraph 14 to request non-application of safeguards and nuclear material intended for the propulsion of a submarine, or some safeguards must be negotiated between the non-nuclear weapon states and the International Atomic Energy Agency to assure that this type of program is exactly that and nothing more. For those who perceive the text of paragraph 14 of INCIRC 153 as too vague, the existence of a gap or loophole in the regime is a reality. But on the other hand, for those who interpret paragraph 14 as containing clear procedures for negotiating with the agents, this gap is not as comprehensive as one might imagine regarding the risks to divert fissile material by the non-nuclear weapon state with a nuclear-powered submarine program. So my argument here is that there is no such gap, since the agent's comprehensive safeguards agreement addresses this issue. What happens is that given the unprecedented nature of this issue, no special procedures or even subsidiary arrangement models for the application of safeguards for this kind of nuclear material has yet been elaborated. So I would like to address this issue, focusing on broadening the discussion regarding such a gap in light of what is provided for in INCIRC 153 and the text of the CSAs signed by Australia and Brazil. Thus, regarding the INCIRC 153, it's worth noting that its paragraph 14 is inserted in the subject entitled Non-Application of Safeguards to Nuclear Material to be Used in Non-Peaceful Activities. And this paragraph, the paragraph 14, provides that the state that will use nuclear energy in a non-prescribed military activity, as is the case of nuclear-powered submarine, shall inform the agents of this decision, make an arrangement with the agents that should contain the period or circumstances during which safeguards will not be applied, and keep the agency informed of the total quantity and composition of such unsafeguarded nuclear material in the state and any export of such material. It's worth noting that there's no deadline for the negotiation to be approved by the agents. In summary, non-nuclear weapon states cannot simply invoke the right to apply nuclear energy to propel a submarine and remove fissile material from the safeguard system. On the contrary, the state must negotiate an arrangement and the terms mentioned above with the agents. To highlight the provisions contained in paragraph 14 of INFCIRC 153, it's necessary to carry out a comparative analysis of this document with the comprehensive safeguards agreements signed by Australia and Brazil. Also, these two countries are the possible non-nuclear weapon states to operate nuclear-powered submarines in a medium time frame. But what does the comprehensive safeguards agreement signed by Australian state say about this issue? The CSA signed by Australia is the INFCIRC 217 and has exactly the same content as paragraph 14 of the INFCIRC 153. That is, it must inform the agents of this decision and make an arrangement with the agents that should contain the period or circumstances during which safeguards will not be applied and the total quantity and composition of such unsafeguarded nuclear material in Australia and of any export of such material. And there is no deadline for the negotiation to be approved for the agents. It's also worth noting that Australia is a signatory to an additional protocol with the agents. Therefore, it will probably negotiate a subsidiary arrangement as provided for in paragraph 13 of its additional protocol signed with the agents. So it's hard to say that the provisions in the CSA and in the AP signed by the Australia will not meet the agents' necessary demands to minimize the risk of any possible diversion of nuclear material used in the propulsion of its future submarines. In summary, there does not seem to be a loophole in the safeguard systems regarding the use of nuclear energy for submarine propulsion in the Australian case. However, despite Australia's exemplary non-proliferation credentials and the agencies engaging with, there was a stronger opposition from some states, notably from People's Republic of China, regarding Australia's future acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines under the AUKUS partnership. The Chinese criticisms have become more forceful and were presented in two working papers, Working Paper 29 and Working Paper 50, submitted for discussion at the 10th Review Conference of the NPT held in New York in August last year. And the Working Paper 50, China expressed its opposition to the AUKUS and its concern about the compromise of the NPT. In summary, the two working papers, the Chinese government expresses its position that nuclear material to be transferred by the USA and the UK to Australia cannot be effectively safeguarded under the current Asian safeguard systems, and it is in contravention of the objective and purpose of the Articles 1 and 2 of the TNP. And the same way as the China, as mentioned by Professor Muhadi, Indonesia presented a working paper expressing concerns on nuclear-powered submarines of non-nuclear weapon states and their possible impacts on nuclear weapons non-proliferation regime. In direct reference to AUKUS, the working paper prepared by Indonesia declares that it is a risk posed by potential proliferation and conversion of nuclear material to nuclear weapons, particularly highly enriched uranium. It's also worth noting that the three AUKUS states also prepared a joint working paper for discussion at the review conference of the NPT, in which they confirm their commitment to provide Australia with a nuclear-powered submarine capability and claim that they are committed to doing this in a way that meets the highest possible non-proliferation standards. And regarding USA and the UK obligations as the nuclear weapon states, the joint working paper clearly states that both countries will not provide Australia with any assistance in contravention of their obligations under the NPT. Furthermore, the working paper clearly states that Australia will not develop a uranium enrichment program or reprocessing facilities, nor will it manufacture the fuel elements used in its future submarines. In this sense, the working paper clarifies that Australia will be provided with completed welded power units. Thus, the possibility that the nuclear material used for propulsion of its future submarines will be diverted is low and be easily identified by the special safeguard procedures negotiated with the agents. In summary, the joint paper of AUKUS members provides a direct answer to all the points raised and the working papers presented by China and Indonesia. However, in March of this year, more fuel, probably nuclear fuel, was added to this question. According to the joint leader statement of AUKUS on 13 March of this year, the AUKUS parts have agreed on 3 stages for the implementation of the AUKUS project during the next 3 decades, which include training and capacity building, acquisition of complete conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines, and acquisition of completed welded power units for submarines to be built in Australia. The announcement points to transferring 3 Virginia-class submarines to Australia and construction something like 5 more submarines based on Astute class. Thus, fueled the questions raised by China regarding a violation of the scope and the purpose of the NPT, as the reactors used in the Virginia and Astute classes use a fissile material enriched to more than 19%, that is to say, weapons grade. In this context, a caveat is needed, which can be expressed in answer to 2 questions. First one is there a gap in the nuclear weapons non-proliferation regime arising from the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement signed by the Australian state? My answer is no. Decision about a gap is overrated. And the second caveat is that receiving Virginia-class submarines or development an Astute class in Australia with S9G or PWR2 reactors violates the NPT? My answer is this is a hard question. And the point is that the answer is not an unquestionable no. So moving now to a very less complex case, there is Brazil. What does the CSA signed with the Brazilian state say about this issue? The Brazilian State Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement with the agents was established in the INFCIRC 435, the quadripartite agreement, following the framework provided for in INFCIRC 153. However, some difference exists between the 2 documents. The subject of paragraph 14 of INFCIRC 153 is present in the Article 13 of the Brazilian Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement and entitled Special Procedures. And this article provides that the state party, it may be Brazil or Argentina, may decide to use nuclear power for the propulsion of a submarine and shall to inform the agents of this decision through the Brazilian Argentine agents for accounting and control of nuclear materials, and to negotiate with the agents which special procedures will be applied to the nuclear material used for propulsion. The arrangement should contain the period or circumstances during which the special procedures will be applied, and the agents shall be kept informed of the total quantity and composition of such material in that state part, or any export of such material. As in the Australian case, it's worth noting that there's no deadline for the negotiations to be approved by the agents. When comparing the text of INFCIRC 153 vis-a-vis that of INFCIRC 435, the difference in common points between the two documents are clear. First of all, it's worth noting that Article 13 of the Brazilian CSA, the INFCIRC 435, does not present any word such as withdrawal or non-application of safeguards, but rather the applications of safeguards through establishing an arrangement involving special safeguards procedures. Besides that, the Brazilian submarine will use low enrichment uranium, and there is not any reprocessing facility in Brazil, and there is no transfer of nuclear technology from any nuclear weapon state to Brazil. A central point should be highlighted here. There is no possibility under INFCIRC 435 that a state part, Brazil or Argentina, will unilaterally declare that the nuclear material related to a nuclear-powered submarine does not require or will be excluded from the application of safeguards. In summary, analyzing the Brazilian case, the point to be highlighted is that affirming that there is a gap or loophole in the nuclear weapons non-proliferation regime appears to be overrated. As my final remarks, one of the central issues underlying the use of nuclear energy and the propulsion of submarines developed or operated by a non-nuclear weapon state is the existence of a possible gap in the nuclear weapons non-proliferation regime related to the possibility that nuclear material could be diverted due to the absence of safeguards. In the two cases, Australia and Brazil, my research points out that the existence of a gap or loophole in the regime is overrated. As both states will have to negotiate an arrangement of special procedures or a subsidiary arrangement with the agents. However, in the Australian case, there is a caveat. Despite there is no gap regarding the safeguards to be negotiated with the agents, there is a hot spot regarding the issue of a possible violation of the scope and purpose of the NPT due to the use of uranium at weapons grade on the nuclear fuel. However, this issue remains open, and it's essential to note that a nuclear-powered submarine is a weapon system that projects power. It's a force multiplier, regardless of how it is armed. Therefore, its possession or operations by other states is probably not something that, a priori, pleases some of the current holders of this type of weapon system. Likewise, this cannot be an excuse for the illicit use of nuclear energy by a non-nuclear weapon state part to the NPT. Almost finishing, I'd like to reinforce that the views and conclusions of these presentations are from myself as a researcher and should not be interpreted as representing the stances of the Brazilian Navy or any Brazilian governing office. Finally, I'd like to say that the points argued here may be useful to highlight some issues on AUKUS, Brazil, and the nuclear weapons non-proliferation regime. That is what we're trying to do in this beautiful night in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and morning in Australia. That's all, folks. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, I personally would like to thank all the speakers for sharing their knowledge about the topic with us today and open the floor for questions. Unfortunately, as I said in the beginning, Dr. Marian Hansen had to leave earlier for personal reasons, but we already have some questions, so I'll be reading them for our speakers now. So the first question was made by Taina, and it is, considering Australia's alienation, political distance from other Asia-Pacific countries, would any Australian action to reverse the situation, seeking greater rapprochement with the countries of the region and getting closer, for example, to the countries of Southeast Asia, would it be enough to obtain the confidence of countries of this region? Since Marian's not here, I believe maybe Wajunu could answer this question, or Marcus Valley also, if you want to say anything. And then I think we can go ahead and answer the question, then I'll read the following ones.
May 1st?
Sure. Yeah.
Excuse me, Victoria?
Yeah, you can answer first.
Well, regarding well, in my personal view, the question from question number 2, right, from Tainá, Australia and Brazil cooperate on some aspect of their projects. Is this?
No, I was talking about the first question first. Then I'll get.
Oh, no.
The
No,
first
I prefer
question.
declining.
Yeah, I was asking Professor Muhaji Soijoni if he wanted to answer the first question.
The first question.
Yes.
Okay. So let me put this issue in the broader context of the Indonesia and Australia relations. As I mentioned earlier, that there has been a high dynamic of the Indonesian and Australia relations, in which the trust is not yet really strongly built in the two countries. And many cases indicate that even small issues can bring the relations between the two countries back to a very low ebb. While at the other time, the relations between the two can be very strong and very close. So in this case, apart from the argument of the loopholes created by the decision of the Australian government to acquire nuclear power submarine, it is about the Indonesian view of how Australian government sees its relations with Indonesia. And as I mentioned before, Indonesia, as the closest neighbor of Australia, hasn't been consulted with the decision, which has a very significant consequences under current situation and the current tension in the region is quite questionable by Indonesian government. So the immediate response by Indonesian government clearly indicates that Indonesian government was very disappointed with that. Indonesian government try currently to see Australia as the closest neighbor. Also, Indonesian government is trying its best to build trust among the two countries and to build a strongest relation between Indonesia and Australia. But with the decision by the Australian government, Indonesia feel that for Australians, Indonesia is not very important for Indonesian in terms of strategic partners. So this is why, with regard to the first question, this decision can create a situation in which Australia is getting further away from the region with this decision. Although at the same time, previously, Australian government is trying to be part of the immediate neighborhood in terms of the good relations and so on and so on. But as I mentioned earlier, how Indonesia see the situation in the Asia Pacific, for example, with the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, Indonesia really would like to see that every single country needs to make any effort to reduce the tension. But the decision by the Australian government tends to increase the tension rather than to reduce the tension. And in international relations, we know about what's so-called the security dilemma. Of course, if we are talking about the decision to strengthen its military capability for defensive purposes, it can always be seen as an offensive effort against other countries, especially this is true in the context of rivalry in the Asia Pacific right now. So this is my response to the first question.
Okay, thank you, Professor. And we have two more questions. I'll make them away, and then you can decide which ones you want to answer. But first one is, could Australia and Brazil cooperate on some aspect of their projects, considering they're both non-nuclear weapon states? And then another question is made by Fernando is, how do the speakers believe the AUKUS partnership is going to further affect the relations between Indonesia and Australia? And could this present any lessons to Latin America despite it being a different context? Thank you. So maybe Marcus, would you like to talk about the second question? Answer.
Or maybe I follow up my
Okay. Yeah.
answer
Mhm.
number 3. I think it has been implied in my response to the first question. The decision by
Okay,
Australia
regarding the
can.
question number 2,
Okay.
I think he's having a bad connection.
Okay, should I proceed?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Of course, as I mentioned, the decision create a strange situation in the relationship between Indonesia and Australia. But Australia tried to rebuild the confidence by sending high regular official, the foreign secretary, as well as the Minister of Defense to Indonesia to explain the decision and so on and so on. And it eased the tension a little bit, but still, given the conflictual context of the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, then the decision is still very difficult for Indonesia to understand why Australia should pour oil into the fire in the context of rivalry between the U.S. and China, especially given the fact that Indonesia as well as Southeast Asia would like to see the reduction of the tension in the region. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually as a lesson learned from the situation for the Latin America. The context may be different. In the Latin American context, there is no rivalry, a big power rivalry like the rivalry between the U.S. and China in the Asia Pacific. So this is a bit different.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Marcus Valle, would you like to answer the first question and then maybe follow up with the third question that questions whether this relation between Indonesia and Australia could also have any lessons to Latin America? So maybe you could answer the second question, which talks about could Brazil and Australia cooperate on some aspect of their projects, consider they are non-nuclear weapon states, and then follow up with the Australia and Indonesia relations, how this could also give any lessons to Brazil and Latin America, and how it relates to its country, its neighbors.
okay, Victoria. I'm sorry, my connection have some kind of trouble, but I'm back here. Trying to answer question number 2. I don't see any kind of possible cooperation, technical cooperation in the 2 programs, nuclear-powered submarines between Brazil and Australia, because the programs are completely different. The Brazilian program is an autochthony, an indigenous program. We have no other nuclear weapon state supporting us and the nuclear part of the project. And we are using a different kind of fuel. We'll use low enrichment fuel. The Australians will use it until this time, at least, high enriched uranium. And so they're completely different. And the first stage of the Australian program, they will something like receiving the car keys, the Virginia class. So are completely different programs talking in a technical aspect. So I can't see any kind of cooperation in this in both programs. But, however, there's a great opportunity of cooperation in positions of this is a right of non-nuclear weapon state to have programs, to have a program like this. It's a right of a signatory of the NPT to develop a nuclear powered submarine. And there's no gap regarding this. My point is this: there's no gap in the nuclear weapons non-proliferation regime because first is a right of the non-nuclear weapon states, Brazil, Indonesia, Australia, everyone. But there are some kind of safeguards to be applied to the nuclear material to be used for the propulsion of these submarines. And this is a point of contact, a common point that must be unite the two programs. Only this, but in a technical aspect, I can see any kind of cooperation. And regard to question number 3, as the question points out, there's a different context, completely different context. Brazil has not hostile neighborhoods. Our countries here are not hostile to Brazil. It's a completely different and South Pacific. To don't talk about Australia, talking about Indonesia, Professor Suhano could explain this in more details. There's a different disputes for sovereign and a lot of islands there, and so it's an environment completely different. And our program here will not start an arms race or nothing like this. Brazil is a country with a enormous, a huge maritime area, and we have a legitimate right to protect this and the way that we find that is the best for us. So this is my point.
Okay. I have a question of my own to ask. I think probably Professor Marcos Vale will better answer it just because it's a more Brazilian associated question. But it has been 25 years since Canada tried to acquire nuclear powered submarines, and almost half a decade, since Brazil started to develop nuclear powered submarines. Hence, as you've commented about the naval safeguards, we need safeguards so that the submarine can operate, so that it can leave the dock. Because if there isn't, we can have submarines, but they won't leave the dock. So I would like to know, it has been so long that Brazil started developing nuclear powered submarines, and Canada already in the 80s presented this complex problem. And I've read many proposals to deal with the safeguards globally. But why is it that I haven't found several written actual proposals to deal with this situation in Brazil? I know we have Brazilians studying and reflecting about this matter, like our speaker, Dr. Marcos Vale, and then also Dr. Matias Spector, Dr. Eugênio Diniz, to cite some, but I haven't not seen a move like abroad to deal with this situation, which is crucial if you are to operate a submarine in the future. So I would like to know why we haven't seen much discussion on this matter, which is fundamental. And I've seen it a lot abroad, especially in the U.S. and other countries, that should be also cautious for Brazil, because those countries are reflecting about this and they can impose certain proposals that they are reflecting on. And why haven't I just think that we need to have this more discussion in the academy if we are to ever operate a nuclear powered submarine. We have to have discussions in the academic sector about proposals to safeguard, to enable safeguards. I'm sure there is internal discussions between the Itamaraty Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Navy, but what about academic discussions about this topic? So I'm also reflecting about this because I see in Australia a country with a much smaller population than Brazil, and I see it being much more discussed, much more engagement within the society and within the academia. So I'd like to know about your reflection about this, because we're investing billions of money in this program, but I feel like there isn't much discussion in society about this matter of security. So And in Brazil, during presidential campaigns, it's not common for them to address foreign policy issues and especially security issues like this. I mean, the last campaign maybe had some, but it is a very important topic. And understand that even though I understand Brazil's security situation is completely different from Australia, I still believe we need to do a better job in getting society interest in this matter so that we can have better discussions. So I wanted to know what is your comments on this topic. Sorry. Maybe a long question. I don't know if you understood it, but I can make it short if you need me to. Maybe more objective.
Well, Victoria, yes, it's a long question, but it's a good point here. Um, I'd like to comment to two of your thoughts. Um, the first one is that engagement on these issues is very good. If you think a more inserted view of the scholars and our nuclear policy, our nuclear program, I see as a scholar and academic as a good thing. You are a good example of this in Brazil. Yes, a young lady, very smart, brilliant, uh, a star, and rising up. And student this question is a very good example of how academic students, good academic students, can be useful for our country to discuss, to argue our nuclear program. So this is a very good point that you raise here. And however, like everything, there's a however. There's not so much people that stood this with the property and the cares that the issue and the sensitivity of the points require. Many people are talks some things that are not grounded in no theoretical frameworks and no research, no deep research, and no nothing, just opinions. And this is not so good in any kind. But good research, as you are doing, is very welcomed, I think, and we have all to win with things like this. Is this?
Okay. I was just want to emphasize that my point is not, we do have academics reflecting about the topic, but like being here in Australia, going to university here and feeling the atmosphere, I feel like, of course, AUKUS is a much, bigger situation because we're dealing with nuclear weapon states, helping non-nuclear weapon state develop those nuclear powered submarines. But I still see here a much bigger engagement between society when there were protests in Melbourne. There was a committee to analyze this when the announcement was made with more than 100 proposals, and I don't see the same engagement in our country, and this is a serious thing. I think
Yes.
that society needs to be debating this, and so that was my concern that I was actually wanting to point out. Even whether or not we should have nuclear power submarines, I don't see this debate. I don't see that big debate. I see it very as a small niche between academia, between the Navy and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but I don't see society as a whole as interested as I see in Australia. And I've listened from academics in Australia say how they believe Australian society is not very much involved compared to New Zealand, which is a much more involved society. But I would still say they're doing a better job than I see being done in Brazil in this specific matter. So that's why I was trying to point it out, just kind of like, trying to engage her in the debate and just have like, just I forgot the word. I just want to hear more about it, perspectives on regarding this matter. Also, maybe in Indonesia, if you'd also like to comment, how is the public engagement in Indonesia with this kind of situation, this kind of area?
Yeah, the Indonesian public does not necessarily aware or in touch with the reality or about the issue of the nuclear weapons and nuclear issues and so on and so on, except on the issue of the use of nuclear energy, because the Indonesian government has once tried to propose to establish nuclear power plants and has a strong opposition from the people. But with regard to the nuclear issues, I'm right now advocating the Indonesian government ratification of the TPNW. And the decision by the Australian government to acquire nuclear power submarine has created a bit problem to this advocacy, because I was invited to the parliament last month to give opinion about the need or necessity for Indonesia to ratify the TPNW. And among the parliamentary members, I saw, while initially they seem to be very supportive of the TPNW, but during the public hearing in which I gave the opinion, I got a strong opposition from some of the parliamentary members, saying that if Australia can have the opportunity to develop nuclear for its submarines, then why should we tie our hands with the TPNW? So we cannot develop anything with the nuclear weapons by ratifying the TPNW. So of course, this is something of indicating the misunderstanding of the issue, but in the public in general, this can be very easy to happen, especially when the public in Indonesia rely more and more on the social media rather than rely on the thorough study from the academics. And apart from that, unfortunately, the academics in Indonesia are not very much interested in the big issues like nuclear weapons or nuclear issues like this one. So it does not help a lot the discussion in the public in Indonesia. So I have to try to convince a member of parliament that we don't have to associate the decision, the need for Indonesia to ratify the TPNW with what happened with the Australian decision.
Thank you so much, and you brought a very interesting point that I didn't even mention, didn't even ask. It's how the Australian decision, how the AUKUS partnership is affecting, Indonesia's decision towards the TPNW. So thank you so much for your contribution. That was very interesting. Is there any questions that Professor Muhadi or Professor Marcus Vadi would like to ask to each other, and before we end our section?
There's one question out of curiosity to Professor Marcus Valley. What is the most important motive for the Brazilian government to develop such a kind of nuclear submarine? Because Brazil is also a strong proponent for nuclear disarmament through TPNW.
Well, I didn't get your last questions, the last parts of your question. Can you say again?
Given the fact that Brazil is a strong proponent of the nuclear disarmament and a strong proponent of the TPNW.
Yes, it's right. But there's one issue. There's nothing with the other issue. The TPNW or what else? Any kind of this disarmament efforts and agreements and treaties are Brazilian as a champion on this, but our program is not related with nor violates, not go against the end of these initiatives. I think are completely distinct things.
Okay. Marcus Valley, do you have any questions to make?
Oh, no, thank you very much, Victoria. Congratulations for your mediation here. It was outstanding, Professor Muhadi. It was a great pleasure to stay here with you. And our professor that stay out, unfortunately, Marianne can't stay with us. It was an outstanding pleasure to stay here with you and exchange ideas on the hot theme, that passion for all of us. Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you very much, Professor Muhadi, and thank you very much to everyone that was watching us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pale, for the very interesting insight and views, and thank you very much also for Victoria and colleagues who prepare for this seminar, and to all the participants.
Thank you. And I would like to thank everyone who participated and listened to this discussion, as well as all the speakers for their insights on this very important topic, not only for Brazil and Australia, but for the world, as Indonesia perspective here represented. Thank you for your contributions. I believe those who are listening will leave this event with a better understanding of this country's perspectives. It was great to hear from all of the speakers here today. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, night, or day, wherever you are. Thank you.